From Jacob tangibly wrestling with God to Martin Luther King Jr. struggling with human rights, the mystical variety through the centuries and in all nations is superb and enormous. So writes the Reverend Charles Brock in the first installment of his ongoing series, Mystics for Skeptics, how to tackle mystical thinking of saints, prophets, philosophers, and statespersons, all of which are available on demand at the Jefferson Educational Society's website at jeserie.org. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spade and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Now joining me in this conversation is the man behind those writings on the mystics, Reverend Charles Brock, an emeritus fellow, chaplain, and director of ministerial education at Mansfield College. Reverend Brock taught at Oxford University for 35 years. He serves as the director of the Institute of the American Dream at Penn State Barron. Reverend Brock is also acting minister of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Girard, Pennsylvania. Now, with the JES from the beginning, Reverend Brock is one of the think tank's founders. And at the JES, he launched the Brock Institute for Mega Issues Education and serves on the Board of Trustees as secretary. From Francis of Assisi to Plato to Bach to Obama, Reverend Brock's been looking at the mysticism of saints, prophets, philosophers, and statespersons. In this conversation, we're going to catch up on some of those, the Reverend Brock's earlier writings, topics he's covered, as well as the mystics we encounter that perhaps we might not have thought of. Those writings all remain available on demand on the Jefferson's website at jeserie.org, where you'll find more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, as well as videos of past programs you can stream on demand. And of course, for more information on JES publications and programs, be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Reverend Charles Brock, thanks for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you. I speak from on high.
You speak from on high, and this is truly an out-of-this-world discussion I'm looking forward to. It's just, I'll go back to that initial quote, and I think this is somebody who thought out of this world. Of course, you, with your quote, from Jacob tangibly wrestling with God to Martin Luther King Jr. struggling with human rights, the mystical variety through the centuries and in all nations is superb and enormous. That got this all started. But you actually started your inaugural piece with a quote from Albert Einstein, who said the most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mystical. It is the power of all true art and science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, Einstein said, who can no longer wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. So what makes Albert Einstein a mystic? Or perhaps first, what makes a mystic a mystic?
Well, it's a really good question, Ben. And Einstein, along with Newton, the other great physicist of the Western experiment, were both deeply religious, and but in very, very different ways. Newton was much more orthodox, and Einstein was sort of world faith's idea, like the 20th century that we have. But what distinguishes Einstein from so many others is that he puts the intuitive before the rational. I have a quote. I'll read it without my glasses. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. That is a terrific quote. It's not quite the mystical quote that I'll give in a minute, but it shows you where his mind is going, that it's really very important. And I found this at Carnegie Mellon, and we talked about this in science. It's really important to look at the intuitive as well as the rational. In fact, you can't get very far in science without being an intuitive person as well as a rational person. That was a revelation to me. But the other thing that he said a little longer about mysticism is this. A human being is part of the whole called by us the universe. A part limited in time and space, he experiences himself, his thought and feeling as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting our own personal desires and our affections to a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. That is a big vision. That is an enormous vision. And I would call that as one of the 10 mystical definitions that I've come up with.
Right. And Charles, I don't want to necessarily ask you to rattle off all 10. Maybe you can, but you know, how do we know a mystic when we see one? What are you looking at? What's the criteria?
Yeah, William James wrote this wonderful book in 1900 called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And in it, he showed that there's so many types of religious experience that really they're hard to count. Mysticism is the same way. And he has a chapter on mysticism. The variety is tremendous. There's no one definition of mysticism, but I'll be glad to go through them as we go through some of the people that we have, and I can give examples of at least 10 definitions that I have found.
Well, and maybe it makes sense to go back to another early writing of yours, and I can't help but see, again, science as a thread here. And you write about Francis of Assisi, and noting that Pope John Paul II declared him the patron saint of ecology in 1979. How do we learn about our mystical connection to our physical world through Francis of Assisi?
Well, certainly one of the early definitions of mysticism itself is to relate to the, as Einstein is saying, to relate to the universe, to relate to the world, and not just to other people. So that you get the notion of Francis of preaching to the birds and the animals. He had a feel for what nature was, and therefore it's something within God's promises to the world, and you can relate to it personally. He did.
And I think that's, you know, an important thread that we see beyond perhaps what we most know about Francis of Assisi, which is his affinity for animals. And I think that's what most of us, you know, who might have gone through catechism or some other upbringing, you know, into a Christian religion, we know that about him, but we don't think of him as a mystic. And so turning your mystical lens from west to east, you take a look at the Dalai Lama and tell us what sort of mystic he is and how his mysticism aligns with that of Eastern philosophy and its approaches to mysticism, because many in the West may not know much about the East. So what do we learn from the Dalai Lama in our connection to him as a mystic and then his connection to the East?
Well, he is a fascinating character indeed. He happens to be my age, so I am sympathetic with him for what he's doing. But he is a major world figure without a doubt. And people know him from his peaceful pursuits and for his condemnation of the Chinese invasion of Tibet and so on. All that is part of his religion. But he's a Buddhist and a Tibetan Buddhist, which is a little different from the Indian or the Malaysian Buddhists that we have. And you have to understand Buddhism to begin with to understand the Dalai Lama. And it's important to know the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, without which it's impossible to understand the Dalai Lama. And the first, they're quite simple, but until you sort of dig into them. But the first noble truth is that we all suffer. But the second noble truth is that you can start to get rid of suffering by detaching yourself. And that is one of the things that's hard to understand. I'll try to explain it. The fundamental cause of suffering is ignorance. And the ignorance is that you don't understand that you are part of the universe. And this goes against most everything in Western religion and philosophy. And I will quote the Dalai Lama. We all have a valid, proper sense of self, or I. But then we additionally have a misconception that I inherently exists. Under the sway of this delusion, this is something like Einstein was saying, we view the self as existing under its own power, established by way of its own nature, and able to set itself up. But the fact is, you cannot find a separate I means that those phenomena do not exist under their own power. They are not self-established. So as opposed to the Western notion of I and you, it's really I and we is part of I. And that is fundamental point of Eastern monism, as they call it, as opposed to Western separation of God and the world. They see the world and God as one, combined like this. We separate them out in the West. That is a fundamental difference in East and West mysticism. I think it can be overcome, but that's another complex topic.
So Charles, with your theological background and as an academic, is it easier, and maybe it's no easier one way or the other, but is it easier perhaps from somebody rooted in Eastern philosophies to understand Western philosophies, or someone in the West, is it easier for them to understand the East?
I think that we go past each other most of the time because you have this I-thou distinction in the West, which is not in the East. So it's really pretty tough to get through onto that. And you have to do some fairly fancy footwork. I think it can be done, as I say. That may be a whole nother session, but it can be done to try to help merge these ideas together. It's quite a complicated question.
Well, and I think that would make a great follow-up conversation here for us to be able to examine that and really dive in. I think another one ripe for discussion, and we'll briefly go through it here, is the fact that thanks to you, Charles, we find the United States presidents can be mystics too. So far in your series, the writings that are available on the JES website at jeserie.org, you featured John Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. Let's go ahead and save the last for last, and let's go ahead and start with Adams first. And what caught me in that piece about Adams is that you note that he's one of the few presidents open to other religions. What brought him to that vision?
Well, it's interesting that he is. You don't hear it from any other president except Adams. Even Jefferson was not very interested in other religions, so he and Adams finally were able to get along really well toward the end. But Adams had a good friend, Joseph Priestley, who was a Universalist Unitarian minister, well, Unitarian basically, who came over to America because he was persecuted in England just before the Revolutionary War, became close friends with Jefferson. And Jefferson attended his church in Philadelphia, the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, now a parking lot. But he had this wide vision. Adams picked it up as well. And a number of other people talked about it, but not so much in public because it was to some extent, one of those questions that you were looked on a little bit askance if you decided that Indian and Chinese religions had something to say. And so they were very careful with what they said. Adams was not careful with what he said. He really liked to belt it out and did so in his very vivid writings.
So skipping forward in American history, next is number 16. You say Abraham Lincoln is a mystic, and you offer writings about him. In your writing on Abraham Lincoln, the mystic, you call him America's Moses. Explain what you mean to that.
Well, yeah, he was probably one of the most religious of our presidents, which often is not understood, even by some fine historical scholars that Jefferson has presented. They don't really seem to grasp the notion of Lincoln's profound religious thinking and reflection. Maybe because we don't teach it in history, we don't teach it in the schools, I don't know. But just let me give you a couple quotes, and that will show you what's going on here. Here's what he said. "We are indeed going through a great trial, a fiery trial. In the very responsible position in which I happen to be placed, being a humble instrument in the hands of our Heavenly Father, I am, and as we all are, to work out his great purposes." And he goes on at some length to talk about the purposes of God, and he wants to link in with this. So there's this notion of coming together, and that is one of the definitions of mysticism, one that's not often thought about. It's that I and the Father are one. I think Jesus meant by that the same thing that Lincoln meant, that I'm trying to do the will of God, and as far as I can understand it in my heart, in my mind, I am doing the will of God. It's a very dangerous thing to say, but on the other hand, it did give Jesus and Moses and the other mystics, and certainly Abraham Lincoln, some confidence to move ahead. And that's how he understood his mission in the last 2 years of his life.
And it is that aligning of his will with what he sees to be God's will,
That's
and
right.
the unity there that I think also. Sorry, go ahead, Charles.
And you feel it. You feel it. I mean, that's part of the mystical thing. It's not just an intellectual grasp, but it's like Einstein said, it's intuitive, and you feel that in your heart and your mind.
Well, and in that, we see Lincoln, I think much like Moses, leading a people to a promised land, so to speak. And while vastly different promised lands in the way we look at them, looking at Lincoln's ability to unify the country back together after its fracture makes total sense as perhaps an analog to Moses.
Yeah, it certainly does. And people called Washington Moses as well. But Lincoln even fits the bill a lot better. And when he condemned the United States, both sides, he condemned North and South in his most famous speech, the second inaugural address, which was just a couple months before he was assassinated. And he understood that the North was just as culpable as the South because we bought all their stuff. We supported slavery economically. So it wasn't that it was just righteous Northerners beating up on the sinful South. He understood both were at fault. And he said, but woe to the world because of offenses, for it must needs that the offenses come, but woe to the man by whom the offense cometh. That's a quote from Jesus. And then Lincoln goes on, if we shall suppose American slavery is one of those offenses, which in the providence of God must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, that he now wills to remove, that he gives both North and South this terrible war, and the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which he believes the living God always ascribed to him? That's a really, really big statement. Nobody understood it at the time. It was only 4 paragraphs long, the second inaugural. People said, is he finished? Is he done? But he had so much to say that now, thick books are written on the second inaugural because it does sum up his thinking. And it's a deeply religious, the most providentially oriented speech I've ever read in the presidency.
And certainly one that we can come back to and do a deep dive on, and that you do a great treatment of looking at Lincoln as a mystic in that writing. But I want to jump ahead, not just 150 so years, but really to our next president, and talk about how you address President Barack Obama. Through your writings about Obama, we learn about liberation theology, and for some of us that aren't theologians or aren't studying this academically, we might wonder, what is that? What is liberation theology? And how do we see that in context of Obama and Obama being a mystic?
He talks about it in his first book, Voyages Around My Father. He went to church, and he wasn't a churchgoer through his life at all, but he ended up in this church where Jeremiah Wright was the minister of infinite infamy in Republican circles. And Obama had this vision. He describes it, it's fascinating, that in all these black churches in Chicago on that day, they're hearing the story of Moses and the story of the Old Testament figures in particular, and how they were suffering because of indignities, because of being oppressed by foreign powers, and that they would rise up together. And so applying the notion of the Exodus, the rising up together against Pharaoh, to Chicago of his day, he understood that was where he was going to go. And he became a community organizer, a politician, and president with all that in mind. He always had that in mind, that was a basis for his whole political theology, and it's very profound. It comes from the Catholic Church in Central and South America, picked up by many black Detroit ministers, and then Chicago ministers as well. And it's big stuff in the seminaries in America at the moment.
So I think we can, I think, apply this question to the next president that you cover. But before I move on to President Donald J. Trump and how he's a mystic, I suppose the question I would have is, are Obama and Trump, and maybe just answer this because we're talking about Obama first, are they mystics because of their position? Or even after the presidency, do you see Barack Obama still being a mystic in his work? He's still young. He has much left to offer, as just a person exiting the office of president. Is he still a mystic, or was he a mystic because he was a president?
He was certainly a mystic before he was the president, right in his youngest days of work there. So I suspect that will carry on. I've not followed his writings or speeches recently, but I suspect he's going to be reflecting on this as time goes on. Now, with Donald Trump, I'm not sure that I would really categorize him so much as a mystic, though it's close to it because he comes from the Presbyterian tradition, as I do. And we were both raised up in that tradition, though we went different ways. Calvin, who's the founder of Presbyterianism, valued work as the be-all and end-all, virtually, of life. Trump thinks work is the most important thing he does. He works all the time. You know, he never takes a weekend off. I mean, they show him playing golf and stuff. He's working all the time. He's never, ever letting it go. He works 90 hours a week or more. Secondly, he values money. And though there's certainly enough in the Bible to show that money can be a problem of evil, the Presbyterian tradition has probably been the most complementary toward being wealthy. Wealth is not a problem. And sometimes it's a little bit of a problem for me as an ex-Presbyterian. But sometimes, which I still value very much, the notion that God favors you and then gives you wealth, and you get that in the prosperity gospel notion in America today among the evangelical churches. I'm not sure I would go along with that, but Trump certainly does. But thirdly, he went off on a different line in Presbyterianism founded by Norman Vincent Peale. He went to Marble Collegiate Church, where my mother used to go and take me when I was young because she liked the prayers. They were short. So that was, for mother, a good place to go. But Norman Vincent Peale has a prosperity gospel and an optimistic gospel. He sounds like the ordinary high school commencement speaker. Just turn your mind to doing what you want to do with your life and you will do it. The world is open to you. Everything is positive. Everything is good. Just go out and do it and you'll be fine. I really think that's just a lot of crap. You know, I really don't think that happens to very many people, except a very few. But Trump has bought into it. Therefore, he has to see everything in optimistic terms. He can't see the dark side of the United States very well. Well, he has in his inauguration speech, but that was a dark side I didn't understand. But he doesn't see the dark side of COVID-19, clearly. He just doesn't see it. And this, I think, is because of a faulty theology. It's not a mystical theology so much. It's just plain bad Calvinism.
When I think the B word that comes to my mind in hearing that is bootstrapping. We hear that often of if you can just pick yourself up, then you're in charge of your own destiny, and we see that taking hold. I think the other thing that you point out well, about President Trump is that while he himself may not seem to be very religious in a conventional sense, the mystic tag may apply to him because he represents more than just himself, and we see a movement of evangelicals following along in this, and we see people clearly interacting with Donald Trump in a religious sense, and it's one of your more compelling reads, and I'd encourage people to go and check that out online. We still have that up at jeserie.org. Two other people you write about, and I think these are big names that we would think of when we think of the mystics. You talk about Moses and Jesus. You have independent pieces on each. Two men. So much has been written about these two, Moses and Jesus. As a scholar, as a theologian, if you could briefly sum them up as mystics, I'd like to hear that. But what drew you to write about two people upon which so much has already been written, but yet you find a way to add new new exciting content to the conversation in their mysticism. So brief description of them as mystics, and how do you as a scholar cover two people as big as Moses and Jesus in, I want to say, less than 1,500 words each, maybe less than 2,000 words each. They're not long reads, but they are very insightful, Charles.
Well, thank you. They are both extraordinary characters, and the two most important people in the Bible, without a doubt. Moses certainly is the most important person in the Old Testament. And what struck me, and this is nothing new from me, but what struck me from the scholars is that Jesus really identified with Moses very strongly. The Gospel of Matthew makes it really clear. The Sermon on the Mount is the new law, the idea of coming to grips with understanding that the law had to be changed is something that Moses did too. But the really big one is the notion of liberation. And here is where our founders understood Moses as the liberator. They wanted to make the seal of the United States, that's Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin. They wanted to make the seal of the United States the crossing of the Red Sea and Pharaoh drowning in the Red Sea. That's what they wanted the seal to be. Congress turned it down. But Jesus was there too. And though you don't hear this very often in church, but my theory is, and I'm not the only one who says this, that Jesus followed Moses in wanting to be Israel to be liberated from who? From Rome. And if you read the Gospels in that way, and just take a look at them again and say, was Jesus trying to really stir up stuff? Wow, I think it just comes so clear. The crucifixion was reserved for insurrectionists, and that's what happened to him. He was not just a blasphemer, he was an insurrectionist, and that was a serious crime, and Rome always wanted to put the insurrectionists on show. So in that sense, he goes with Moses. Martin Luther King, the same way. Martin Luther King's last speech was, I've seen the promised land. I'm not going to get there with you, but I've seen it. The people will get to the promised land crossing the mountain. I've been to the mountaintop. That's Mount Nebo in Old Testament terms. And so he fits in with that whole pattern of liberation as well. Obama understood it, and a number of other presidents, and the founding fathers certainly understood it.
And that reminds me of a lecture that you've given at the JES several times, Jesus as Rebel, and talking about that. I'd love to be able to bring that back and have a digital conversation around that. But I want to go back to one of the subjects we mentioned earlier, and that was St. Francis of Assisi. That's not the only saint you cover in your Mystics series for the Jefferson. You also talked about the patron saint of France, Joan of Arc, and what we find there is that she's hearing the voices of saints, and she's communicating. It's a really captivating captivating read from you. Tell us about Joan of Arc and her hearing the voices and hearing the saints, because I want to talk about yet another person who's hearing from ghosts just in a second.
Well, I think that's one of the definitions of mysticism. You hear the voice of God or the voice of saints. You hear them, and sometimes you see them. Francis of Assisi had the stigmata where his hands were stuck and bleeding, as did Padre Pio, as other mystics of the Catholic Church have done. But for Joan of Arc, she heard these voices at 16, 17 years old, and by 18 years old, she's leading the army of France. She convinced the Dauphin that she was God's chosen. And, he must have had a mystical experience to understand that point, because he gave her the commission. And she won. She went to Orleans and beat the British and beat them all the way to Paris until people started to cheat on her and give her a tough time. And then the church decided that she was not a saint at all, and they burnt her at the stake at 19 years old. I mean, if you can imagine anybody that you know at 19, a woman in medieval France leading the French army. But she got that from her experiences of St. Catherine and the other saints that she ran into in her fields, in the fields outside of Domremy, where she was brought up as a farm girl.
Right,
as a cowherd.
Right, and that's again,
no education whatsoever.
all before the age of 19. And actually with education, that's something that I wanted to ask you toward the end, because I think that speaks to some of the mystics of old that we've seen. But I'll ask it now, Charles. In today's context of mystics, do we have to have a formal education? Because we see folks that you're covering, again, a cowherd in France, who is able to lead an entire army and hears from the saints, no formal education at all. How important is education to one's mysticism? Do we need that education to be mystic, or is this something otherworldly?
I don't think you need an education. I mean, Joan of Arc is the best example. She had no education. She was a cowgirl. That's all she knew. I mean, I don't think she had any schooling whatsoever, and yet there she was. On the other hand, you have Einstein, you have Obama, who's one of the best, and John Adams, the two best educated presidents we've had, Jefferson included. Jefferson's not a mystic, but certainly Adams and Obama are and were. And so, sure, what education can do is show you that there are many ways of looking at mysticism, not just one way. And I think that's really terribly important.
And a new mystic that you talk about, speaking of heartland and someone who comes from, and I think I might be putting it mildly, humble beginnings.
Yeah, very humble.
You cover Sarah Smarsh, who has an absolutely breathtaking book in Heartland, and it's a must read. I've recommended it to several friends. I think it's a great book. You do a great treatment of this, and of her hearing her ghost and how she relates to this other being and her conversations back and forth in her memoir. So how did you find Sarah Smarsh, and how are you identifying her as a mystic today?
Well, it was just an amazing book. I read about it somewhere and I ordered it and I couldn't put it down. It really is a terrific thing. I hope we can get her to the Jefferson sometime. That'd be a wonderful time. She has invented this child that she never had and talks to her all the time. And the child really becomes real. And I don't think that's delusional. I think that's just the way the mind can work. And she accepts this child. The child talks back to her, and she talks to the child. It's a loving relationship, and she gets had a terrible upbringing, but she gets her satisfactions and her insights from this ghostly child, and that's another kind of mysticism. It's more of a secular mysticism than religious, but it's still there, and it shows you that you can have these unusual relationships with what a psychiatrist might say, purely a figment of your imagination. Well, maybe it is, but for her, it's really real. And it made a huge difference to her life and made her into something now that's just a marvel to see. And she's on television a lot, I understand. And so I certainly intend to look her up, and let's get her to Jefferson.
Here to that. I would love to be able to talk to her and explore all she has to offer our audience. I think that would make for a great conversation. A great listen, though, and I mentioned it in the opening, I hinted at one of your mystics is Bach. And we look at the musical nature of mystics. And so you say, when I listen to music, I often forget about the words. The music itself is so profound, often dance-like and joyful, but he also seems to be able to plumb the depths of my personal being. It is a strange but wonderful experience, and I'm always glad to see what other respected musicians and religious thinkers have made of him. So you treat Bach as a mystic and give him the mystical treatment in your series and explain why. What makes Bach so mystical?
He really seemed to understand the depths of the problems of life. Out of the depths I cry unto thee. He really seemed to grasp that. He understood what people said about that, even though sometimes he didn't necessarily experience himself, though he did have troubles. But he understood other people, and he understood the joys as well. And certainly the joyful nature of his music, I think it's the most joyful stuff I've ever heard in my life. And it just uplifts the soul. And I feel I'm floating away with Bach without losing my feet on the ground, and that's the important thing. Keep your feet on the ground and your head in the clouds. That's what Bach was able to do musically.
Well, and certainly you've got a head in the clouds there with that background floating in outer space. And so to sort of round out, because I don't want to give it all away, because I do want to encourage people that, maybe picked up on the Mystic series a little bit late in their readings, that those are still available online. People can go and see the older versions. But people who haven't plugged into any of them can have a chance to read all of them online. So I don't want to give it all away here in this discussion, as I know we'll come back and have more discussions on this, Charles. But I guess just simply put, why do we humans love the mystics? Why do we want to listen to them? What do mystics teach us that's important to our own understanding of us? And I guess more importantly, then, why are you writing about the mystics and you have a series where you're teaching us about these?
Well, I suppose it's just the ordinary human condition of wanting to transcend yourself from time to time. You don't have to do it all the time. In fact, mystical experiences, I have not had very many. I don't think people have, they're not just loaded. It's not just every time you walk out the door, you're going to have a mystical experience. But maybe it's only one or two times in your life that it happens. But boy, it's so powerful, so profound, and it affects your life that you have new understandings of who you are, what the world is, and what your mission can be. I think those are important. And it's always linked to mission, in the sense, not of converting other people, in the sense of finding something to do with your life. So that all the mystics have a job to do, and they all relate it to a task or tasks of politics or of religion or of helping other people or being a nurse or a gardener or whatever, making life beautiful for somebody and for oneself at the same time. So it always has a practical effect. It's not just floating off into the sky. I think that's so important, even though my background looks like I'm doing that. But it's really so important to make sure that you test yourself by your fruits. By their fruits, you shall know them, as Jesus once said. It's one of the great quotes for mystics as well as for everybody.
And so from the interesting viewpoints of Einstein wrestling with the two types of mind as a scientist, from the repugnant history of Plato that us Westerners are shocked by and ignore in his teachings, while keeping the rest of his canon, to looking at United States presidents and how they are mystics, to looking at contemporaries, young people who are having this experience. How do you, Reverend Charles Brock, wrestle with all of this in terms of being able to make sense of it all yourself and then transmit it out to us, the readers, who know far less when it comes to theology and mystics than you do? How do you make sense of all of that, Charles? You're wrestling with big things.
It's the advantage of being 85 years old. Being the Dalai Lama, that's the great advantage. I think I haven't come to this until the last few years. So it really is part of my super maturity, as it were, in age, if not in thought, that I've been able to do this. And teaching 55 years has helped a lot too. It's also just, I've been curious about these people. They are fascinating people to read. They've done so much for the world, and I just couldn't keep away from them. That's what happened.
Well, I know, Charles, I for one say I'm grateful that this has been a curiosity in this point of your life and that you're offering these writings to us. And I can't wait to see who is up next. So Reverend Charles Brock, the director of the Brock Institute for Mega Issues Education at the Jefferson Educational Society, the think tank you helped found. Thank you so much for taking time to join us in this conversation to unpack your Mystics for Skeptics series that you've been writing for the Jefferson. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Your questions were really, really good. And I would have put them on an exam myself, if I were examining people. Thanks a lot for such insightful points.
I really appreciate that, Charles. And we appreciate all you, the viewers, tuning into this broadcast, watching or listening at home. Thanks for listening. Thanks for learning with us. To read Reverend Charles Brock's Mystics for Skeptics series, head over to the Jefferson's website at jeserie.org, where you'll find other writings, reports and essays, and many other fascinating and engaging reads that we're publishing on a regular basis, as well as more information about both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs, programs that you can stream on demand that were recorded and have already been recorded, to upcoming events that you can look forward to. And of course, be sure to connect with us on our social platforms. Be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram, Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.